Don't mind my face. I am not wearing any makeup because I feel like I'm gonna get emotional in this video. And I sat down earlier today and filmed a separate video that was really emotional. So I don't know why I'm doing all of this to myself in one day, but I just really felt compelled. Anyways, what's up? Welcome back to my YouTube channel. As you can see by the title, this is my breastfeeding experience. If you are new and you have not seen other videos of mine, I am a twin mother. My baby girls are 6 months old, which is crazy. I am officially done breastfeeding. I breastfed my babies for 6 months and I want to talk about that experience. I have had so many of you reach out and ask on YouTube and on Instagram about my experience and ask for tips, and I feel like I've been able to talk with a lot of you and not necessarily give like tips or advice, because I sometimes don't like calling it that, but I just have offered my experience to you, and I've given you some things that have worked really well for me and things that didn't work well for me, and it's all completely dependent on your own experience. No one's breastfeeding journey is exactly the same. And so I'm saying all of this now because my experience is mine, and I think a lot of it will hopefully be relatable, but I also think there are probably things in my experience that you'll disagree with, that you found not to work for you. I think that everyone's journey is different when it comes to breastfeeding, and we all just need to give each other grace. And the reason that I really want to talk about this is because I want to remember it. I already feel like, you know, my early days of breastfeeding, I'm so grateful that I have my notes written out, because I don't even remember what that was like, probably because some of it was a little bit traumatic and I blocked it out from my memory, but I'm going to relive it with you now in this video. What I'm trying to just say is that everyone's experience is different. I think I got that point across, but also that your experience that you end up having is probably going to look different from what you expect. And you know, I know some mothers set out to breastfeed and it goes as beautifully as they could have ever dreamed, and that's so wonderful if that's the case for you, but I know that doesn't happen very often. Everyone's experience is usually different than they expect it to be, and so I hope that if you have gone through this before, that you can find comfort in hearing from someone else. I just ate like 15 chocolate chip cookies, the mini ones from Trader Joe's, and now my jeans are tight. Maybe I should just get into it and stop trying to like start this video so articulately. I structured this video in a timeline type of way. I want to walk you through what my journey was for the 6 months that I was feeding my babies from my body. Each month I tried to just like write down the certain things that took place that month, what the experience was like, because as you're breastfeeding, like your body's changing, your babies have different demands, like there's so much that happens, you know, through each week, honestly, of breastfeeding. And so I wanted to really capture that, because I didn't know that before having children. I actually had no idea what to expect, and I thought I did. You know, you can do so much research, but you just don't know until you're in it. You just really don't. And I mentioned that I just filmed another video. I'll link that up here. It was my Nicu experience, and very similarly, I had heard of a Nicu before. I just didn't know what it would be like until I was experiencing it for myself, and it's the same with breastfeeding. And I set out with a lot of goals for breastfeeding, and a lot of things that I, you know, envisioned for myself didn't happen, and that's okay. Give yourself grace. That's like the underlying message and sentiment of this video, is give yourself grace. Okay, so let us get right into it. 1 hour post-delivery. So I also can link up here, I have my birth story where I talk about the birth of my girls. I talk a little bit about those early days trying to get my body to create milk and all of that. Like I talk in detail about that. I'm going to talk a little bit about it now as well. But 1 hour post-delivery, I started pumping. And so my girls went right to the Nicu when they were born, and I knew that I wanted to breastfeed. And so I kept asking the nurse, like, when can I start pumping? When can I start like that chapter? And you have to like wait for your recovery. Your body needs to heal a little bit post C-section, which is how I delivered my daughters. And there's a few different things they have to check to make sure you're good to start putting yourself through the pumping process, which is a lot on your body. And so once I was good to go, it was about 1 hour post-delivery, I began pumping. And what I did first was hand pumping with the nurse. And my nurse is so incredible. Her name's Deb. We still keep up with each other. I love her so much. And she was there with me and she helped me to pump. I used to hand pump and I got colostrum out. And I just remember feeling so amazed when I saw that colostrum, because my girls were delivered at 34 weeks. So in my mind, I kept telling myself, there's no way your body's gonna have milk at 34 weeks. There's no way that you're gonna be able to start feeding your babies, like blah, blah, blah. The doubt comes flooding in. I learned that it doesn't really matter if you deliver early, because your body begins to stimulate milk once your placenta leaves your body. So when I delivered my daughters, my placenta left my body and it triggers something in your body to start stimulating milk, which is just so beautiful and crazy to me. I was fortunate enough that with a good amount of pumping, I was able to get a good amount of colostrum that was brought right up to the NICU for my daughters. My girls could not orally feed. They were on feeding tubes, but they were still able to rub the colostrum on their cheeks and put a little bit on their lips. And so they got the benefit of that milk. And I stored a good amount of it to give to them later when they could take food orally. So a good tip, if you have NICU babies that cannot feed at birth, you can store some of that colostrum and give that to them later. From then, I pumped every 1.5 to 3 hours every day, constantly. So like round the clock, pretty much like roughly every 2 to 3 hours, sometimes 1.5 hours, I was pumping because I needed to stimulate milk, and just with having 2 babies, I obviously needed double the amount of milk. And so I was just constantly pumping, and I was not with my daughters as much as, you know, a lot of mothers are, because they were in the NICU. So I had this worry that because I wasn't with them as much, my body wouldn't innately know to like produce milk. So I just wanted to keep, you know, stimulating myself. And so I was on the pump a lot. I did give myself a 5-hour break at nighttime to sleep. I had a lactation consultant recommend that to me because she said it's actually better for your body to create milk if you do give it that rest. Like rest is good for us when we're breastfeeding, and it can actually stimulate milk better. So I didn't feel guilty like taking that 5-hour break at night. Whenever I could, I would go up to the NICU and put the babies on me to stimulate milk. Any second that I could put them on me, I would. And my daughters needed to be in their incubators a good amount in their first few weeks of life. And so I could not have them on me like constantly, which was so hard, but I would put them on me as much as I could, and I would always put them on me before a pumping session. Sometimes when I could, I would have them on me like the whole time in between pumps. That really helped me to stimulate milk. I could literally feel my like boobs swelling when they were on me. And I would try social nursing. So this is something that you can try even though your babies are on feeding tubes, if that's the case for you, and even though you know they can't like actually latch to you, you can just social nurse. So I would put Sienna and Ren on my chest, and they would just kind of like go around my nipple. They start like licking and doing things that they know like naturally to do, but they just aren't ready to actually like do the act of breastfeeding. I would put them on me constantly to socially nurse. And again, I would do that always before I would pump. And I continued to have them social nurse until like week 2 when they started to latch, which I'll get to. And even when I couldn't have the girls like near me or on me while they were in the NICU, Jonathan would always take pictures and videos of the girls while we were with them. And then like those first 5 days when I was recovering in the hospital, we would go back to my room, I would pump, and he would show me pictures and videos of the girls to just help me to stimulate milk. Emotionally, it helps because when you're first starting to pump, it's painful. And especially if you are in a situation like I was where I could not like feed my babies directly, you don't get that like bonding. It's very like sterile, and it's very painful to just only be on a pump in those early days where your body's not used to it yet. Looking back, I like don't know how I got through that period. it was hard pretty much the full 6 months, but to think back to how dark of a place I was at emotionally in those first few weeks, and especially like the first week, like not being with my daughters a lot and not getting that experience, like it was so dark, and it's actually really hard to look back on that. And every time I hear of a mother in a similar situation, I just am in awe of her. Okay, so that was kind of just like the early days while I was in the NICU. Again, in my other birth story and other videos, I talk more in detail about that experience, but that's what it was. It was just pumping around the clock, doing what I could to stimulate myself, and just getting milk to them however I could. They were on formula at first because they needed to get their birth weight up. When babies are born prematurely, a lot of times they put them on formula because they really need to continue growing. But eventually they were completely off formula. Like, I think after the first 5 days or something, they were just on my breast milk, and they continued to gain weight from that point on. Going into month 1 and 2. So a few things that I wrote in here. The first being embrace the hunger. If you are feeding another human or humans from your body, you need to eat. You need the calories. You burn so many calories while you're pumping or breastfeeding that your body is just trying to be replenished. And so embrace the hunger. It is like insane. Like the way that I would eat everything in sight and then some. I was so hungry. So just embrace that. The thirst, always have water by your bedside or wherever you are pumping or breastfeeding. It's so important. Like the dehydration is so insane. And so hopefully you have a partner that can just actively give you water all the time. This is kind of like what my first month looked like. So I wrote that the majority of the girls' first month was spent in the NICU. So the girls were on a feeding schedule where every 3 hours I would put the babies to breast for 30 to 45 minutes, then offer them fortified breast milk via bottle, and then I would pump. So to just kind of go through what that experience was like the first month or two, at that point, I was still trying to put the babies to my breast, so they were on a feeding schedule every 3 hours. So they needed to feed every 3 hours, which meant that I would, you know, every 3 hours put them to my breast for about 30 to 45 minutes, and they would kind of social nurse. And after that, I would then need to give them their bottle, which would take 30 minutes, and then I would need to pump. So essentially every like hour, I was starting this process over again. And once I hit like week 2, they would latch, and I am so grateful that I had like, I'm so grateful that I have the experience where they did latch a few times in like that second, third, fourth week. I think with each baby I had like one successful nursing session where they were able to have a full feed off of my body, and I'm so grateful that I had that. But pretty much every time I would put them to my breast, they would like scream and cry because they just couldn't figure it out. With being born prematurely, getting used to the bottle and the NICU, like they just couldn't get the milk from me. And I saw so many lactation specialists. Like I worked so hard for 2 months to get them to latch. And it's so emotional because when you're exclusively pumping, you don't get that bonding experience. And if anything, trying so hard to put them to your body and it just not working is really, really traumatic. And so every 3 hours I was triple feeding. I was putting each of them to my breast for about 30 minutes. Jonathan would take one baby and I would bottle feed for 30 minutes. Whatever like hunger they still had because they couldn't get from my breast, they would take in the bottle, and then I would pump for 20 minutes. And it was just constant. Every like hour, that was just what I would do for 2 months. And I just remember like dreading it because I would get hopeful, and I just remember getting hopeful at every single feed, hoping that this would be the time that they would latch and we would have a successful experience, and it just never happened. I'll get to it, but after 2 months I just couldn't do it anymore. So then the girls came home after 22 days in the NICU, and they started to cluster feed at home, which was so hard to keep up with because at this point they were only on my breast milk. I'm pretty sure, I'm getting the exact timeline confused. No, up until 1 month they were on fortified milk, so they were on breast milk and formula, because we had to get them to 1 month postpartum to ensure they were gaining enough weight to then get off the formula, which did happen. But essentially that first month, like when we brought them home after 22 days, they started cluster feeding, and I just like could not keep up with them. I was trying so hard. My rule of thumb and what I was told by my lactation consultants was, you know, make sure that you're pumping every time they're feeding so that you can keep your supply up. And so there was a certain point where they were feeding like every hour. Like it was insane. When they cluster feed, it's so normal, and especially for preemie babies that are so little, they're really trying to work towards that higher weight. And so when they were cluster feeding, like literally nonstop, I either had a baby on my breast, I was bottle feeding a baby, or I was pumping. Like it was just, there was no break. And this was for like a month. I couldn't do it anymore. Like I felt like I was being selfish, because when I was putting the babies to my breast, like they were crying and screaming, and it just wasn't working, and they were hungry and they weren't able to figure it out. And I wanted it so bad, and I'll admit that I wanted it, and clearly it just wasn't what they wanted. And I slowly started to only put them on my breast for like 5 minutes, or I would skip a feed and try to only put them to breast like a few times a day. In my head, I'm like, I'm sacrificing this like practice time where we can be trying to get this to work, but it's not working. And like, how selfish are you? You know, you're able to get your milk to them through a bottle. That's what's working right now. It's like this push and pull, and I'm meeting with lactation consultants. I'm going like once or twice a week back to the hospital to try to get this to work. And you know, when you have twins, there's that lack of support your partner can give to you to help make this work. Like I remember the consultant saying to me constantly, like, oh, you know, when you're putting the baby to your breast, your partner should be like massaging your breast, and your partner should be like helping the baby latch on. And in my head, I'm like, my partner is feeding my other child at this time. Like, if we don't have them on a similar schedule, then it's even less time that we all have in the day. It's really hard to look back on that period of time, because I wanted it to work so bad. And if I could just like tell that version of myself anything, it would just be to just let go of the expectations that you have and stop perfectly. I just would remember in my brain, I just had this like vision of having them both on my breast and feeding them and having it be this beautiful, beautiful experience. And I wanted it so bad. Like I still get sad when I think about the fact that I never got that. Like I never will have that. And I know for a lot of women, like it's not, they don't even care that they don't get to have that. But for me, like I can't help that I wanted it so bad. And I will just like never forget the day that I just stopped putting them to my breast, and it was so emotional. And I'm saying all of this because I've talked with a lot of you, especially twin moms, that have gone through the exact same thing. It's crazy to me because I felt like I was the only one feeling all the things that I was feeling, but I've talked with a lot of you, and a lot of you are in that period of time that I was in. And if I could tell myself anything, it would have been to just stop sooner. You have to figure it out on your own. Like this is not me telling you what to do at all. Like I'm so grateful that I exhausted myself, because when I look back, even though it's hard, I know I made the right choice. I'm getting so like off track here. I would always pump for 20 minutes, but if milk was still flowing at 20 minutes, I would wait until the milk stopped, and then I would add 1 to 2 minutes to stimulate more milk production. But I always pumped for 20 minutes. That was my rule of thumb. A lot of times my milk would drain in that period, but if milk was ever still coming out, then as I mentioned, I would just pump a little longer, because you need to essentially, you would think like, oh, I'm draining my milk, that's good, but you actually have to like tell your body to make more. And also I wanted to touch on like how we kept up with like cleaning bottles and all of that. I'm grateful that I had Jonathan, because he was really responsible for like cleaning our bottles. He hand washed bottles for the first like 2 months. After every single time he would like sterilize them, hand wash them. Eventually we really used our dishwasher, and we used the like sterilize feature of our dishwasher, and that does work just fine. We would kind of wait till the end of the day and like do all of that. A lot of people with pumping, especially if you're exclusively pumping, they take the pump parts and put them in a Ziploc bag after a pump, and put it in the fridge because it keeps it like sterile, and then throughout the whole day just take it out of the Ziploc bag, pump, and put it back, and then at the end of the day would sterilize. That may work for you. It works for a lot of people, but to each their own. You kind of have to figure out your groove and figure out what works for you. I finished my second month. I'm entering month 3, and this is where I hit my breaking point. And I wrote in here that I made one of the hardest decisions I've ever had to make, and it was when I stopped putting the babies to my breast. And it just was so hard. It was like so hard. And I know I just mentioned I just filmed like my Nicu experience video, and that experience was so difficult, and this was like equally as difficult. And as hard as it was, like, it was the best decision for our family, 100%. Although it was so hard, the day I just decided I would not be putting them to my body anymore. Instead, I got more like cuddles and snuggles after a feed, and I got some time back to really enjoy them. And although it wasn't feeding them from my body, it was like nurturing them. And there are beautiful ways that you can still connect with your newborn even if you're not able to breastfeed via your breast. Because breastfeeding via a bottle is still breastfeeding. I just wrote that I was so emotionally and physically exhausted from triple feeding. Triple feeding is what it's called when you put your baby to breast and then you bottle feed and then you pump. It's a very known term for a lot of mothers, and it was so hard to do. I felt like I wasn't the best mother for my girls while I was triple feeding, and once I realized that, that's when I knew it was time to stop putting them to my body. And then I wrote, soon after this, I really found my groove and felt like I got this, which is true. It's like extremely emotional low, and then I hit a high. I felt like, okay, this was the best decision. I got time back. I felt like I hit a groove. I mentally just turned a switch in my brain and said, this is my reality. And I kind of just like pushed all of that, those traumatic 2 months of breastfeeding, to the back of my mind and focused on like the path forward of being an exclusively pumping mother. And I started to celebrate that for myself. And I definitely had days where I mourned the loss of this experience I wanted so bad, but I was able to feel good about the future of my breastfeeding. Something that I did start doing around this time was feeding my girls while pumping, and this is very difficult, and it took me a long time to figure out how I was going to do this, but I wanted more time back for myself and for my family and for my daughters. And when I would just be feeding them and then pumping, it took time away from me being able to cuddle them and nurture them. And so I started to, and I'm going to show you the position I was in because this worked for me. I would sit like this actually in my bed. I would always pump in my bed, and I would have the pump on my nightstand attached to me, and I would sit my girls like this pillow is them, and I would sit them on my knees while I was pumping and feeding them like this. So they'd be laying kind of on my upper thigh, and that way I was able to pump, feed, remove the pump, finish the feed, and have that bonding and snuggle time. And that was just so special and a big reason why I felt like I was able to like continue with breastfeeding, because it just allowed me to have more bonding time with them. I didn't have to like put them down right away to pump. And so that worked, and I've given that tip to a lot of moms, and I think it's been helpful. And eventually they got too big that I couldn't do that anymore, but eventually they need to feed less. So it kind of all evens out. At least it did for me. They were feeding about 6 times a day at that point, and the girls would sometimes take longer stretches at night, but I would still wake myself up to ensure that I kept pumping every 3 hours roughly to make sure my milk supply stayed up. It was really important for me to just have them be on only breast milk, and they were on only breast milk from 1 month on, and I just needed to keep my supply up. So that's something that is hard. You know, your baby may start sleeping longer stretches, but if you're an exclusively pumping mother, you don't get to take those longer stretches. You need to wake up. Even if you're not an exclusively pumping mother, most breastfeeding moms, in those early days especially, wake up to pump and don't get to sleep because you need to keep the supply up. And that's a personal choice. If your supply is okay, if you have one baby, you probably can take longer stretches unless you get really engorged and you need to relieve yourself. But for me, like, I would wake myself up because with 2, I needed to keep my supply up. I was able to store some milk, like I had a little bit of an oversupply, but not much. So I wasn't getting much sleep. And I wrote in here that I would have these moments, and honestly, I would have them up until my last day of pumping, like recently, where I would have this extreme urge to put them to my breast, like extreme urge, because it didn't work and because I wanted it so bad. I would have these like innate urges, and I've read about it. It's very normal and it's not something that I should be like embarrassed about or whatever, but I would just have this like urge and like physical pain because I couldn't put them to my body anymore, because I had told myself, like, that's done, that's behind you. If you regress back and try it again, it's going to be traumatizing. Like, you did your best and that's okay. But I just, again, want to say that it's normal if you're having those feelings, and you'll still have days where you're really proud of your experience and you know it's the right decision, but you'll also have days where you question yourself and you wish that you could just put them to your body. But it's okay. That's all I can say, is that it's okay. So moving to month 4. So again, like month 3, I really hit my groove. Like, that month was the best month of my breastfeeding experience, and I'm really grateful for that. I felt good. But month 4, I started to not keep up with my daughter's supply. They were feeding much more. They were hitting growth spurts. They were having cluster feeding sessions, and I couldn't keep up. And I felt so defeated. I felt like I finally like hit a groove. All that I had going for me was that I could feed them only my breast milk, and even though I wasn't feeding directly to them, like, they were only having my breast milk, and all these things that just were telling, my brain was just going into like, you're a failure mode, you're a failure. And it's just so horrible, because I don't want anyone to ever feel like that. And I wish that I could have just like told myself, it's okay. Like, any amount of breast milk they're getting from you is okay. Like, you have to fortify, that's fine. And fortifying is when you add formula to your breast milk. And so it took me time to accept that, but we started fortifying their milk. It was only a little bit of formula that they needed, and at a time they were getting like 1 ounce of formula for, you know, X amount of ounces of breast milk. And so my goal was to always have more breast milk than formula, but eventually, once we got to month 5, that was not possible. And in my last month of breastfeeding, they were getting more formula than breast milk because my supply just started dipping. Even as my supply dipped, I did power pump, which is extremely difficult and like emotional, and you can look up different ways to power pump, but it's essentially like an hour of pumping. It's like kind of insane, but if you have the time to do it, it can help your supply, at least temporarily. But it wasn't possible for me to power pump like every day, and when I would power pump, I would get a little bit more milk, but then it would just go back to normal. And again, like, I had a lot of breast milk, but they still needed a little bit of formula in month 4, and then in month 5 they needed about equal parts formula to breast milk. I did decide at month 5 that, you know, 6 months is going to be my finish line with breastfeeding. Emotionally, I just knew that was it for me. So what I learned is that when you are going to wean off breastfeeding, it takes like 1 week per session to wean off. So if you're pumping, like at that time I was pumping 5 times a day, that's like 5 weeks of weaning. If you want to get rid of like 1 pump a day, it takes a week to get rid of that, which is just crazy. And I was someone that was really prone to clogged ducts. I was so nervous about getting mastitis. You can look up resources online. If you have any questions, like, I'm always happy to answer, you know, specifically about my experience. But that's what worked for me. And so each week I just essentially dropped 1 pump session. And so they were still getting my breast milk throughout month 5 so that I could get to 6 months. And throughout this whole process, I was getting really bad clogged ducts. Even though I was going about it the right way, I was getting so many clogged ducts, and there's a lot of things that can help with that. I would really massage. I would have Jonathan like really massage the duct, like take his elbow and like press into it. It's so painful, but once you get it out, it's so worth it. Hot compresses, so I would put heating pads on my breast, and then hot showers would help me too, like right before a pumping session. So every time I would have a clogged duct, it would not last more than a day. Luckily, it didn't result in mastitis, but that's a real thing. So just be very careful and talk with like a lactation consultant if you're going to start weaning. By like 5.5 months, almost 5 months, 3 weeks, I was down to 2 pumps a day. And so weaning was so emotional for me. It still is kind of crazy that I'm no longer feeding my daughter's breast milk. Like it all just happened so fast. But I wrote weaning was really emotional these last 2 weeks because you get the clogged ducts. Essentially, it's the reminder that you still have milk in your body. And, you know, just like how it was difficult for me to stop putting them to my breast, it was so difficult for me to stop breastfeeding because I still had milk. That's the reality of it. My body was not saying, okay, I'm done, I'm dried up. Like for a lot of women, they just naturally dry up. Like I did still have milk, but emotionally, like I could not breastfeed any longer. The pump was just taking a toll on me. It was taking time away from my daughters. Even when I was just pumping 4 times a day, like it was time that I wasn't getting with my girls. I didn't mention, but I went back to work at month 5, and my pumps in the morning were time that I could have been with my daughters, and I made the decision that it needed to happen. And so needless to say, though, it was really emotional, and every time I would get a clogged duct, I would question myself and say, like, why am I going through this if I could still feed them? But I just had to remind myself that this is the decision I made, and it is the best decision for me and my family. So that's just the mindset you have to adopt in these situations. Eventually, the clogged duct stopped, and I was down to my last pump that I needed to drop. So essentially I was almost at 6 months exactly. It was like a few days before I hit 6 months, and I needed to just do a few days of one more pump and then I would drop it. And it was a Sunday a few weeks ago, and the girls got RSV, and it was so scary. We spent the afternoon in the ER, and I was supposed to pump that evening, but I just wanted to be with them and nurture them and care for them, and so I just didn't pump that day. And that was it. That was the last of my breastfeeding experience. And it's just so ironic. Like, I always thought it would be this big emotional thing the last time I pumped, but instead it was just gone because I needed to care for my girls. And it was almost beautiful in a way because I just did what I was supposed to do. I cared for my daughters. I spent that day with them, and that's where I was needed. I was no longer needed on the pump. And I'm grateful for that. I'm not grateful that they got sick. It's horrible, but I'm grateful for the lesson that I got out of that experience. And I'm grateful for the entire breastfeeding journey. It changed me. It was the most formative experience of my entire life. And it's taught me that I need to celebrate myself more often, and that motherhood teaches you more about life than anything else. You know, you go from pregnancy, which, I mean, for me it was a high-risk pregnancy, but I think in general you go through this insane period, and then you jump right into motherhood, and there's no time to stop and celebrate yourself. There's not. I still haven't celebrated my pregnancy. I haven't, and most mothers don't, because you have a newborn and that's your priority. But I hope one day I can celebrate that period of time, and I hope you all can too if you become pregnant and have children, because pregnancy in itself is so beautiful and hard, and we don't have time to celebrate that. And then same thing, you know, I just spent 6 months breastfeeding, and then it was over, and my girls got sick, and I've just been caring for them since, and I really haven't stopped to fully celebrate that experience yet. And I need to, because I'm strong, and I just accomplished something so beautiful and so wonderful, benefits that my daughters are going to have the rest of their life. And maybe my way of doing that is by creating this video and talking with you all, but I hope I can just leave you with the reminder to celebrate yourself, celebrate every hard decision you've had to make as a mother, because this is not easy, and it's emotional, and it's isolating at times, and you doubt yourself. Being a mother is the most thankless job, but if we can just like come together and celebrate each other, then it makes it worth it. And if anything, just celebrate yourself, because you deserve that. So that's all for this video. I, again, love connecting with you guys. I hope this is helpful. Please message me. I love talking with you all on Instagram. It's a little bit of an easier place for us to message. I always respond over there. So follow me and definitely let me know if this was helpful for you, or ask me questions, or share your opinions and your thoughts. I mean, everything is welcome here. This is such a safe space, and I just appreciate you for giving me this place to connect with you. I just love you guys so much. I love all of your support, and I will see you in my next video.